Selenara stood at the window of her living ship and watched the stars move past her like streams of light, and she felt nothing but calm because she had seen this view for 3,000 years, and nothing surprised her anymore, and nothing scared her anymore, because when you live forever, fear becomes a distant memory that you can barely recall. Her ship was alive in the truest sense, and it responded to her thoughts. It's like an extension of her own body, and the walls glowed softly with bioluminescent patterns that shifted according to her mood, and right now they pulsed with gentle blues and silvers, because she was at peace behind her. In the vast chamber that served as both throne room and dragon nest Vexrith, the dragon stirred from his meditation, and his massive form uncoiled slowly, and his scales caught the light and threw it back in 1,000 different colors, and his eyes opened, and they glowed like twin stars in the darkness. The dragon spoke directly into her mind through the bond they had shared for 3 millennia, and his mental voice was deep and warm like distant thunder. And he said that the humans were calling for help again, and that their ships were being destroyed by the Krell swarm, and that they wanted the stellar council to send aid. Selenara turned away from the window, and her reflection showed her what she always saw, and pointed ears that marked her as one of the ancient elven race, and eyes that glowed with inner light, and skin that had not aged a single day in thousands of years, and long silver hair that floated slightly in the ship's low-gravity. She was beautiful in the way that immortal beings often were, and she was dangerous in ways that most mortals could never comprehend, because she had been trained in combat arts that were older than most civilizations, and her armor grew from living metal that bonded to her skin and responded faster than thought itself. The humans had been in space for only 2 centuries, which seemed like yesterday to Selenara, and they had spread across hundreds of worlds with the enthusiasm of children who had just discovered fire, and they built colonies faster than they could protect them. And now the Krell had found them. The Krell were an ancient enemy, and Selenara remembered the war against them from long ago, when her people had been forced to use weapons that scarred reality itself just to drive the insect swarm back into the void, and the cost had been terrible, and entire star systems had been rendered lifeless, and the Elven Empire had nearly destroyed itself in the process of winning. Now the Krell had returned, and they had evolved, and they were stronger and smarter, and they coordinated through a hive mind that allowed millions of organisms to act as one, and they adapted to every weapon and every tactic, and they consumed everything in there. Selenara had watched the humans fight the Krell for 5 years, and she had studied their tactics with academic interest, and she had noted their courage and their creativity, and their absolute refusal to surrender even when defeat was certain. And she had found it all very interesting, in the way that an immortal finds mortal struggles interesting, but she had never gotten involved because it was not her war, and because she had learned long ago that immortals who attached themselves to mortal causes only ended up watching everyone they cared about turn to dust. Vexrith I shifted his massive bulk and moved his head closer to where Selenara stood, and his breath was warm and smelled faintly of ozone and stars, and he asked her what she planned to do about the human distress. Selenara told him they would do nothing, because the Stellar Council would debate the matter for months, and by then the human sector would have fallen, and the survivors would adapt, or they would die, and either way it would not concern them, because they had their own mission surveying the outer reaches of known space. The dragon made a sound that might have been agreement, or might have been skepticism, and he said that perhaps she was right, and that mortal races rose and fell like waves on an ocean, and that it was not their place to interfere with the natural order of things. But then he mentioned that the distress call had come from a Captain Lydia Hayes of the human vessel, Defiant, and that she was trying to evacuate civilians from Threshold Station before the Krell Vanguard arrived, and that there were 200,000 souls on that station, and most of them were families and children. Selenara felt something stir in her chest, and she told herself it was just indigestion from the plasma fruit she had eaten earlier, and she told Vexrith that it was unfortunate, but that 200,000 lives was a small number compared to the billions that would die if the Krell advance continued, and that saving them would accomplish nothing in the larger scope of the war. Vexrith was quiet for a long moment, and then he said that he was simply providing information, and that the decision was hers, as it always was, and that he would support whatever choice. Medesalera closed her eyes and reached out through her ship's neural network to scan the sector, and she could feel the Krell fleet like a spreading infection and thousands of bioships, moving with terrifying coordination and adapting and learning and consuming everything before them. In the middle of that nightmare was Threshold Station, and its defensive grid was failing, and a handful of human warships were fighting desperately to buy time for civilian transports to escape. She could see that they were outmatched and that they would all die within hours. Human ships fought with primitive weapons compared to what Selenara could wield, and their tactics were crude, and their ships were fragile things of metal and circuitry instead of living biotech. But they fought anyway, and they threw themselves at impossible odds without hesitation. Sela watched one human destroyer charge directly into a cluster of Krell bioships and detonate its reactor in a suicide run that destroyed dozens of enemy vessels and bought the civilian transports another few minutes to flee. She watched, and she felt nothing because she had seen countless acts of bravery over the millennia, and death had lost its ability to move her centuries ago. But then Vexrith spoke again, and he said that the humans would die, but they would die trying, and he asked if that should not count for Sumith and Zalinor. Opened her eyes and looked at her ancient companion, and she saw wisdom in those draconic features, and she saw judgment perhaps, and she remembered a time long ago, when she had been young by elven standards, and when she had cared about things like honor and duty and protecting the weak, that had been before the last Krell War, and before she had seen what total war looked like, and before she had learned that survival meant making hard choices and not looking back. She told Vexrith that they would make one pass over Threshold Station and provide cover fire for the evacuation, and then they would leave. Because she owed these humans nothing, but she would not stand by and watch 200,000 people die when she could prevent it with minimal risk. The dragon expressed satisfaction through their bond, and the living ship responded to her will and turned in space and began accelerating toward Threshold Station and toward the nightmare that waited there as they traveled. Selenara prepared herself for battle, and her living armor flowed over her body and sealed itself, and weapon systems that had not been active in decades came online and hummed with barely contained power. She told herself this was just a simple rescue operation and that she would engage the Krell long enough for the humans to escape, and then she would withdraw and continue her survey mission and forget about this entire incident. Within a week, she had no idea how wrong she was. She had no idea that she was about to meet a human captain who would teach an immortal warrior what it meant to be truly afraid. She had no idea that in the next few hours everything she believed about mortality and meaning and the value of short lives would be turned upside down. Vexrith prepared himself as well, an ancient power built within his massive frame, and his scales began to glow with inner fire, and he spread his wings in the vastness of space, and energy crackled between the membranes. Together, they approached Threshold Station. And the elf who had lived 3,000 years, and the dragon, who was even older, and they both believed they understood the universe and its laws, they were about to learn that sometimes the briefest candles burn the brightest. And that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it, and that real fear only comes when you have something worth losing. The Krell swarm waited ahead, and behind them the human ships fought desperately, and Selenara guided her vessel toward the battle with the confidence of someone who had never truly been challenged. She was about to discover what it felt like to fight beside beings who knew they were going to die and chose to stand anyway. She was about to learn what humanity really meant. The human ship called Defiant was breaking apart piece by piece, and Captain Lydia Hayes stood on the bridge and gave orders like she was not watching her vessel die around her. Explosions shook the deck beneath her feet, and sparks rained down from damaged systems overhead, and the view screen showed the nightmare approaching and hundreds of Krell bioships moving like a swarm of predatory fish, and each one was covered in chitinous armor that seemed to have been grown rather than built. Lydia was 43 years old, which meant she had lived barely a fraction of what an elf would consider childhood, and her hair was already gray from stress, and her hands bore scars from too many close calls, and she had attended so many memorial services that she had lost count. But should never abandon people who needed her, and she was not about to start new Lieutenant Kate. Morrison worked at the tactical station, and her young face was pale in the red emergency lighting, and she called out that they had lost hull integrity on multiple decks, and that the evacuation transports were full, but the station still had 30,000 people waiting. Lydia gripped the arms of her command chair and told Morrison to inform the transports that if they had cargo holds, they could fit people, and if they had engine rooms, they could fit people, and that they were not leaving anyone behind another. Impact sent a shudder through the ship, and Lydia tasted blood where she had bitten her lip, and she watched the Krell swarm growing closer on the view screen, and she knew with mathematical certainty that her ship would not survive the next 10 minutes. The Krell bioships were horrible to look at, and they moved with organic grace in their weapons. Sprayed acids that could eat through military hull plating like it was paper, and they learned from every attack and adapted their defenses and got stronger with each passing moment. Humanity had been fighting them for 5 years, and in that time, the Krell had only become more dangerous because the hive mind shared knowledge instantly across millions of organisms, and what one learned, they all learned. Morrison suddenly called out that a new contact was dropping out of faster than light travel, and that the energy signature did not match anything in their database, and that it was enormous. Lydia looked up at the view screen and saw something that made her forget about the Lady Krell for a moment. The ship that appeared was beautiful in a way that human vessels could never be, and it was all flowing curves and crystalline structures that caught starlight and threw it back in prismatic patterns, and it seemed to pulse with inner life. And beside the ship, floating in the void, was a dragon. The creature was 300 meters from nose to tail and covered in scales that shimmered between midnight blue and silver, and its wings were folded, but she could see energy crackling along the membranes, and its eyes glowed like distant stars. Lydia had never seen anything like it, and for a moment she forgot how to breathe. Communications officer said they were being hailed, and Lydia told him to put it through, and a voice came over the speakers that was female and musical and spoke with an accent that Lydia could not identify. The voice said that this was Selenara of House Moonwhisper, and that she was moving to engage the Krell vanguard, and that the Defiant should maintain defensive position and continue evacuation operations. Lydia found her voice and said they appreciated the help, but that there were over 600 Krell ships in the swarm, and that whatever Selenara was planning, she should know the odds. Selenara said it was beyond Lydia's concern and told her to focus on saving her people, and then the channel went silent. Morrison muttered something about arrogance, and Lydia could not disagree, but she also could not look away from the view screen because she needed to see what would happen next. Crystalline ship and the dragon began moving toward the Krell swarm, and they accelerated with a confidence that bordered on madness, and Lydia thought they were going to die, and that this mysterious savior would last maybe a minute before being overwhelmed. Then the dragon spread its wings. Space itself seemed to ripple and bend in arcs of blue. Energy danced across those massive scales and built in intensity, until the creature blazed with the light of a newborn star, and then it opened its mouth and unleashed destruction. The beam that shot forth was not fire in any normal sense, but concentrated stellar fury that carved through Krell bioships like they were made of tissue paper, and where it touched them, the organic vessels did not just explode, but broke down into their component atoms in bursts of violet light. Morrison said a word that would have gotten her written up in any other situation, and Lydia did not correct her because she was thinking the same. But the dragon and its companion were not finished, and the crystalline ship moved through space like liquid light, and weapons that Lydia could not identify tore into the Krell formation, and crystalline spears appeared from nowhere and impaled bioships and caused them to convulse as energy feedback destroyed them from within. For 10 minutes, Lydia watched this immortal warrior and her dragon hold back an entire swarm, and it was the most beautiful and terrible thing she had ever witnessed. And Selenara fought with precision that came from thousands of years of practice. Elf made it look effortless and easy, like she was dancing rather than fighting for her life, and Lydia felt hope bloom in her chest for the first time in hours. But then she saw something that Selenara had not noticed yet, and her blood turned to ice. Morrison saw it at the same moment, and said that the Krell were adapting, that they were changing their formation, and that they were learning Selenara's patterns. Lydia had fought the Krell for 5 years, and she knew their greatest strength was not individual power, but collective evolution, and every tactic you used, they learned from, and every weapon you fired, they adapted to, and if you gave them enough time, they would develop counters to anything Zelena had given them 10 minutes, and for a hive mind that shared consciousness across millions of organisms, that was more than enough. The Krell stopped engaging directly and instead began to surround the Enza crystalline ship in 3-dimensional formations, and cutting off escape routes, and the bioships began secreting a strange substance that hardened in space and formed barriers that Selenara's weapons were less effective against. With each shot, Lydia realized with horrible clarity that Selenara was about to be trapped, and she asked, "Morrison, how long until the last transport cleared the station?" Morrison said 4 minutes, and Lydia knew she had a choice to make. The smart choice was to take the gift they had been given and run and save the 200,000 civilians and live to fight another day, and any reasonable commander would do exactly that. But Lydia Hayes had never been reasonable, and she could not watch someone die for her. Without trying to return the favor, she told her helmsman Ray Cooper to bring the ship about and set course at full thrust toward Selenara's position. Cooper turned to stare at her like she had lost her mind and said that they were barely holding together as it was, and that they could not possibly make a difference against that many Krell. Lydia said she was aware of that, but to do it anyway. Morrison's voice was quiet when she said that they did not have the firepower to help, and that the elf and her dragon were handling more than their entire fleet combined, and that flying into that mess was Lydia said she knew, but that Selenara could not see the trap closing, and that maybe they could give her the opening she needed to break out. She opened the all-hands channel and told her crew that what she was asking required them to fly directly into a Krell kill zone to help someone who could probably destroy them without trying, but that Selenara was out there dying for strangers, and that Lydia would be damned if she abandoned her to the same fate they had been facing 10 minutes ago. One objected, and Lydia felt pride swell in her chest, because this was humanity at its best, and this was why they would never stop fighting, no matter how bad the odds became. The Defiant turned toward the heart of the swarm, and as they accelerated, Lydia opened a channel to Selenara and told her they were going to draw Krell fire to give her an opening to escape Selenara's. The voice came back confused and saying that what Lydia was proposing was suicide and that it made no logical sense. Lydia said they were already dead 10 minutes ago, and that Selenara had given them borrowed time and that they were just giving some back. Selenara tried to argue with math and logic, and Lydia cut her off and said she did not have time for math, and asked Selenara to promise to make it count and to tell the council what was coming, so the people they saved would know someone was still fighting. The Defiant entered the kill zone, and every Krell ship in the sector turned toward them like a wave of hatred, and Lydia gave the order to open fire. Their weapons were primitive compared to what Selenara wielded, but they were effective at drawing attention, and every Krell bioship redirected toward the human vessel. What happened next occurred too fast for human perception, but Lydia saw enough to understand her. Crew fought with everything they had, and engineering teams rerouted power from life support to shields and bought them seconds, and weapons officers fired manually when systems failed, and damage control teams sealed breaches with their own bodies. The Defiant was dying, but it was dying the way humans always died, and fighting until the very last moment and making every second count. Lydia stood at her station as the ship came apart, and she kept calling. Selenara understood her mistake at the exact moment when the Krell trap closed around her, and 3,000 years of combat experience screamed warnings through her enhanced senses. Swarm was not retreating but repositioning, and the bioships she had ignored were weaving something between themselves and it. It was an organic energy net that was now contracting around her position. Like a closing fist, she told Vexrith they needed to leave, but the dragon said he could see it, and that these creatures learned too quickly, and that the same tactics would not work twice. Her living ship spun and unleashed crystalline spears that punched through the Krell barrier, but the substance regenerated almost immediately and grew thicker with each passing second. She had fought the Krell in the ancient wars, but this swarm was more evolved than those primitive hordes, and they had spent millennia adapting and improving and becoming something far more terrifying than the nightmare her people had barely survived for the first time in centuries. Selenara felt uncertainty touch her like cold water then. Her sensors detected something approaching from behind, and it was the human vessel. Defiant accelerating directly toward the swarm's heaviest. Concentration and its shields were already failing from previous damage. Selenara asked what they were doing, and Vexrith said that the humans were coming to help her, and his mental voice carried something that might have been respect. She said they were going to die, and her enhanced perception calculated trajectories and probabilities, and she could see the exact moment when the Krell would target the human ship, and she could predict when its reactor would breach and kill everyone aboard, could save herself by using their sacrifice as a distraction, and the math was perfect, and the logic was sound, and 3,000 years of survival instinct told her this was the correct choice. But something about the way the Defiant approached made her pause, and there was no hesitation in its course, and no wavering in just a straight line into certain death. The communication channel opened, and Lydia Hayes told her they would draw Krell fire, and that Selenara should use the opening to escape, and not to argue or thank them, but just to go. Selenara said that what Lydia was proposing was suicide, and that she understood this. Lydia said they were already dead 10 minutes ago, and that Selenara had given them borrowed time, and that they were giving some back. Selenara tried to explain that it was illogical because Lydia had gained hours or days, but was trading it for mere seconds. Lydia cut her off and said she had no time for math, and asked Selenara to promise she would make it count and get to council space and tell them what was coming, so the people they saved would know someone was still fighting. The Defiant entered the kill zone, and Selenara watched as every Krell vessel in the sector redirected toward the human ship. The human crew fought with everything they had, and Selenara's enhanced senses caught every microsecond of what happened next. She saw engineering teams routing power from life support to shields and buying seconds of survival, and she saw weapons officers firing manually when automated systems failed, and she saw damage control teams sealing hull breaches with their own bodies when the bulkheads would not hold on. On the bridge, she saw Captain Lydia Hayes standing at her command station as the ship disintegrated around her, and still calling orders and still directing fire and still fighting with everything she had. In the last 3 seconds of her life, Selenara had seen countless beings die across millennia, and death was universal and inevitable and mundane, but she had never seen anything like this. She had never seen creatures with decades of life remaining choose to spend it all in a handful of heartbeats, and burning their brief existence with such intensity that it rivaled the light of immortals. The Defiant's reactor began to breach, and in that moment, Selenara made a choice that would change everything. Instead of escaping through the opening Hayes had created, she redirected every ounce of her ship's power into a technique her people had forbidden after the ancient wars because the cost was too high and the drain too severe. She did not care about the cost any more. Space folded in a way that was not faster than light travel, but something older and more dangerous. And her crystalline ship teleported and appeared directly beside the Defiant just as the human vessel's containment field collapsed. She shouted for Vexrith, and the dragon spread his wings wide and wove a shield of pure force around both ships, and it was a barrier that had taken him centuries to master them. Defiant's reactor exploded with the force of a small star, and the shockwaves slammed into Vexrith's shield and vaporized 600 Krell bioships in an instant when the light faded. Selenara's ship hung in space with every system screaming warnings, and her own body was burning with feedback from channeling that much power beside her. Cradled in the dragon's shield like an egg in a claw, the Defiant drifted, and it was shattered and breached and barely recognizable, but it was intact. Selenara gasped and asked for life signs in Vexrith. Said that there were 73 humans alive, including their captain, and that they were venting atmosphere and needed immediate help. Selenara it was already moving, and her ship's systems locked onto the Defiant, the tractor beams, and pulled it close, and her hands were shaking, and she could not remember the last time her hands had shaken. The remaining Krell were regrouping, but they had lost coordination, and the explosion had disrupted their hive communication, and it would take them minutes to reorganize. Minutes were enough as her ship's medical systems activated to receive the survivors. Selenara stood in the docking bay and watched. The first humans come through the airlock. Captain Lydia Hayes stumbled out, and her uniform was burned, and her face was bleeding from cuts, and her left arm hung at an unnatural angle, and she should have been dead a dozen times over, but she was grinning. Lydia said that Selenara had stayed, and that she had actually stayed. Selenara stared at this mortal woman, who had just bet everything on a stranger's compassion, and somehow won, and she said that Lydia had been going to die. For her, Lydia swayed on her feet, and Selenara caught her before she fell, and the elf could feel the human's heart racing and feel the heat of blood pumping through fragile veins and feel the terrifying intensity of a life that could end. So icily Lydia said that someone had to teach Selenara that even immortals needed friends. So Madame Selenara said she did not understand, and that humans had so little time but spent it. So recklessly Lydia interrupted and said that was exactly why they spent it like that, because they did not have forever, and so they made every moment mean something behind them more. Survivors flooded into the bay, and humans were helping each other and calling for crewmates and weeping with relief and grief. Together Selena had thought. She understood mortality, and she had watched civilizations rise and fall, but she had always watched from a distance, and from the safety of immortality. She had never stood in the middle of it, and felt its heat and tasted its desperate intensity. Asked about the evacuation transports, and Lydia said they were clear and away, and that 200,000 people were headed for safety. Because of Selenarathan, Lydia added, because of both of them together. Selena looked at this broken triumphant human and felt something shift in her ancient chest. It was not fear, because she had already learned that. And this was something else, and something more dangerous. It was hope, she told Lydia, that the Krell were reforming, and that they needed to move, and that her ship could carry the survivors, but they would be traveling at light speed for days to reach Council Space. Lydia said then they were roommates, and that she should warn Selenara that humans snored as the ship prepared for faster. Then light travel. Selenara found herself making another decision that would change everything. She asked Lydia how she would like to teach an ancient warrior about this thing called humanity that made them all so terrifyingly insane. Lydia laughed, and then winced from pain, but said that Selenara had just gotten her first lesson, and that she would teach her the rest. Selenara asked what the rest was, and Lydia said it was learning why humans were so dangerous when you fought beside them instead of just watching from orbit. Selenara did not understand yet, but she was starting to suspect that real fear was not about facing death, it was about having something worth living. Fourth ship jumped to light speed, carrying 73 impossibly brave souls, and one very confused immortal who was beginning to learn what it meant to truly live. The human survivors had been aboard Selenara's ship for 3 days, and the ancient elf was beginning to understand why her people avoided extended contact with mortals. They were everywhere, and they made noise constantly. Her vessel had been designed as a sanctuary for two beings who valued silence and solitude, but now it echoed with voices and laughter and arguments and songs, both mournful and joyful. The humans had turned her meditation chamber into a medical bay, and her artifact storage into sleeping quarters, and her observation deck into something they called a common area where they gathered to talk and share story. As Alira stood outside what had been her private quarters, and now Captain Hayes and her officers occupied it, and she could hear them through the door planning and discussing as if they had not nearly died 3 days ago. Their voice was still rough from smoke, but she was directing her people to compile everything they had learned about the Krell swarm, and their adaptation patterns and their hive communication signatures, so they could present real intelligence to the council. Instead of just warnings, Lieutenant Morrison said they were not military analysts, and that they were barely qualified for this kind of work. Lydia cut her off and said they were the only humans who had seen this swarm and lived to document it, and that made them qualified. Auxiliara moved away from the door and found Vexerith waiting in the ship's heart, and the dragon's scales had regained some luster, but he was still recovering from the energy he had spent saving the Defiant. The dragon asked if she was eavesdropping, and his mental voice carried amusement. Salona said she was observing, and that the humans were preparing reports as if the council would actually listen to them. Vexerith said the council should listen because humans had been fighting this war for 5 years, while the council had been debating for 3. Zelenora, said the council. remembered the last Krell war, and the weapons they had used and the scars they had left on reality itself, and that they feared repetition more than extinction. Vexrith asked what she feared now, and it was a loaded question because they both knew. Something had changed in her during the battle before. She could answer her ship's alert system activated and showed a proximity warning. And they were being followed. With Senna's hands moved across the neural interface, and the display showed there. Faster than light wake, and there barely detectable was something matching their course. She said they were Krell scouts, and that they were being tracked at Vexrith. Said it was impossible because they had jumped through 3 different vectors and that Krell hive ships should not have faster than light capability advanced enough to follow them. Then he stopped and realized they were evolving that. Quickly Solera ran calculations and saw that the scouts were maintaining distance and not attacking, and that they were being herded toward an ambush ahead along their projected course to Council Spaceship. Said they could not outrun the Krell with their power reserves depleted, and she stopped herself. But Vexrith finished her thought. He said not. With 73 humans slowing them down, the words hung between them and Selenara knew what logic demanded and what 3,000 years of survival instinct told her to do. The humans had escape pods and she could leave them at the nearest habitable system and continue alone at full speed and reach Council space to warn them. It was mathematically sound and tactically perfect. She said she needed to inform Captain Hazevix. Rith sounded genuinely curious when he asked if she was really going to consult with mortals instead of just making the decision. Selenara said that a mortal had saved her life by offering to die for her and that she owed them at least a conversation. She found Lydia on the observation, staring out at the streaked stars of faster-than-light travel, and the captain had refused sedation despite her injuries because she said she needed to stay alert. Solera explained their situation and told her about the Krell scouts tracking them and the ambush waiting ahead. Lydia listened without interrupting, and when Selenara finished, the human was quiet for a long moment. Then Lydia asked how long it would take Selenara to reach safety without carrying the human. Solera said 14 hours at maximum acceleration. Asked how long with the survivors aboard, and Selenara said 36 hours, and that they would never make it because the ambush was positioned at hour 2012. Lydia nodded slowly and said that Selenara needed to drop them off and run, and that it made sense as Selenara waited for anger or accusations, but instead Lydia smiled that same fierce grin she had worn while piloting her ship into certain death. Lydia said that Selenara was not going to do that though, because otherwise she would have just done it instead of coming to explain. Solera admitted she did not know what she was going to do, and that 3 days ago the choice would have been obvious. Lydia asked what changed, and Selenara said she had watched humans turn her ship into chaos, had watched them plan briefings they might never deliver, and watched them live with such intensity even while being hunted. Lydia laughed and then winced from her healing ribs and said that was humanity, and that they did not have the luxury of living any other way. She said the secret was that humans were terrified all the time, and scared of dying, and scared of failing, and scared of wasting their brief time, but that they had learned fear was not a reason to stop, but a reason to matter. Solera said it made no sense. Lydia said it made perfect sense, because immortals could afford to be cautious and take their time. But humans only got one chance, and so when they found something worth fighting for, they grabbed it with both hands. Selenara stared at this mortal woman who would burn out in less than a century and felt understanding. She said that humans were not brave despite being mortal, but because of it. Lydia said now Selenara was getting it, and then she suggested that instead of abandoning each other, maybe they should work together to kill the Krell, who thought they could hunt an elf warrior and her dragon. Solera said they had 73 injured crew on a ship not designed for combat with passengers, and that the odds were terrible. Lydia said the odds had been terrible at Threshold Station 2, and they were all still alive. Selenara found herself laughing, and it was a real laugh, and not the polite sound her people used, and she said humans were insane. Lydia asked if Selenara was in. Selenara called to Vexrith through their bond and asked how he felt about teaching the Krell the meaning of fear. The dragon's laughter rumbled through her mind, and he said he thought she would never ask over the next 6 hours. The ship became organized chaos, and Lydia's crew turned out to be incredibly resourceful when motivated. They connected human weapons to elven power systems, and they programmed combat drones with tactics that made Selenara uncomfortable because they involved things like suicide runs and false surrenders and psychological warfare. Selenara said these tactics were considered war crimes by most civilized species. Lydia said it was good the Krell were not civilized then, and that they were trying to kill everyone and that humans were just trying to make them regret it. Selenara asked if Lydia's species had really weaponized guilt, and Lydia said they had been doing that for thousands of years before leaving their planet as they approached the ambush point. Selenara felt that sensation again, and the one she had first experienced at Threshold Station. It was not cold calculation of survival and not distant academic interest. It's fear, and real fear, and not for herself but for these fragile beings who had convinced an immortal to gamble everything on a plan involving teaching an ancient hive mind about human spite. She told Lydia quietly that if they survived, she wanted to learn more about humanity and everything about them. Because she had spent 3,000 years thinking she understood mortals and was realizing she understood nothing, Lydia corrected her and said when they survived, not if. Selenara amended her statement and said when they survived she wanted Lydia to teach her about making every moment matter. Lydia's hand found hers and squeezed briefly, and the touch of warm living flesh reminded Selenara how fragile these beings were. Lydia said it was a deal, but warned that the full course took a life out to Milena. Said they had better make sure Lydia had won. Then the Krell ambush activated exactly on schedule, and bioships materialized in a perfect killing formation that should have overwhelmed them, but they were not expecting an elf who had learned to fight like a cornered human, and they were not expecting a dragon who had caught mortality's fierce urgency like a disease. They definitely were not expecting 73 humans who had turned a peaceful vessel into a weapon. The battle that followed would be studied later, not for its elegance, but because it showed that the most dangerous thing in the universe was not the strongest or smartest or oldest. It was the one with nothing left to lose, and someone worth protecting. Zella fought beside mortals and learned what it meant to truly live in every desperate moment. The Council of Stellar Species met in a chamber that had witnessed 10,000 years of galactic diplomacy and stuff. Representatives from a dozen ancient races sat in their designated areas, and their various forms were lit by soft quantum light. Selenara of House Moonwhisper stood at the speaker platform, and for the first time in 3 millennia, she felt the weight of all those watching eyes beside. Her captain, Lydia Hayes, stood in her formal dress uniform and looked uncomfortable but determined. And the humans' injuries had mostly healed thanks to elven medicine and her species' stubborn refusal to stay down. Behind them, holographic displays showed footage from the ambush battle in Krell bioships being destroyed by forces that fought without honor or mercy, but with devastating effectiveness. High Arbiter Theln spoke, and his voice filled the chamber, and the ancient crystalline being had overseen council proceedings since before Selenara was born, and he said the council acknowledged their report in that the testimony about Krell evolution was concerning, but that the solution proposed was unprecedented. Selen said unprecedented times required unprecedented responses, and that the Krell had evolved beyond what they faced in ancient wars, and that they adapted faster and coordinated better, and their numbers were exponentially larger, and the old strategies would not work. Council member Vrax pulsed with skeptical colors and asked if the solution was really to recruit humans, and if a species barely 2 centuries into spaceflight was the answer to an extinction-level threat. Selenara said yes. Without hesitation, the chamber erupted in discussion, and she had expected this because the council was composed of ancient species who measured time in millennia, and to them humanity was an infant race. Lydia stepped forward and asked quietly if she could speak. Theln's attention shifted and asked if the human wished to address the council. Selenara interjected and said that Captain Hayes had earned that right because she and her crew had destroyed 18 Krell bioships while wounded and operating on an unfamiliar vessel, and had developed tactics in hours that bypassed adaptations the hive mind spent days perfecting. Vrax said that spite was not a valid military strategy. Selenara countered that it had worked because humans did not fight the way ancient species did, and they improvised and adapted and did whatever it took to win because they could. Not afford to do anything else? Lydia stepped into the speaker circle, and Selenara could see the captain's hands trembling slightly from the effort of containing everything she wanted to say. Lydia began with respect and said the council was having the wrong conversation and that they were asking if humanity was qualified to help, but the real question was whether the council was ready to help humanity. The chamber went completely silent. Lydia continued and said humans had been fighting the Krell for 5 years and losing colonies and watching people die and begging for support from species with power to help, and what did they get in return, she said. Debate and discussions and concern, her voice hardened, and she said the Krell did not debate and they consumed, and while the council had been deciding if the threat was real enough, millions of her people had died. Theln started to say the council must consider various factors. Lydia cut him off and asked how many humans had to die before they were worth saving. She said she had watched Selenara fight at Threshold Station, and that one elf and her dragon held off a swarm, destroying her fleet, and that taught her the council had always had the power to save them, but just needed a reason to care. Lydia turned to look at Selenara, and the elf saw raw pain and anger in those eyes. She told the council that the Krell were coming for everyone eventually, and that they had always been coming, and that the council beat them back once but did not finish them, and now the Krell were stronger and smarter and had found prey that fought back. Rax asked impatiently what her point was. Lydia said the point was that the council did not need humanity's help but needed their perspective, because humans were the only ones who remembered what it felt like to face extinction and fight anyway. She straightened to full military posture, despite being young by council standards, and said if they wanted to survive, they should stop acting like immortals with all the time in the world and start acting like people who understood that sometimes the only way to win was to risk everything. Silence fell, and Selenara watched council members exchange glances and saw subtle shifts that indicated consideration and doubt and intrigue. Ithal said the human spoke passionately, but that passion alone was not military doctrine. Selenara activated the holographic display and pulled up battle data from their escape and said these were casualty ratios from their engagement with the Krell ambush, and 0 losses on their side and complete enemy destruction. She said this was achieved by combining Elven technology with human tactical innovation. She showed another display and said these were projections based on continuing current council strategies, and it showed total species extinction within 3 cycles. Then another display showing projections based on implementing integrated defense using human tactics with council resources, and it showed Krell advance halted within 2 cycles and counteroffensive possible within 5 racks. Said those numbers were optimistic. Lydia countered they were conservative, because they did not account for the one thing humans brought to every fight, which was the ability to learn under pressure. She said the council had been studying Krell for millennia, but humans had been bleeding against them for 5 years, and that 5 years of actual combat taught more than 5,000 years of analysis. Selenara saw the moment when the tide shifted, and it was not Theln who spoke, but council member Jala, whose species had been losing their war against Krell expansion for Decadescala, asked what exactly they were proposing. Salona said an alliance and not humans serving under council command, but an integrated force in human tactical innovation combined with council technology and resources. She said they would create rapid response teams and small units that could adapt faster than the hive mind could counter, and they would fight the way humans fought, which was dirty and desperate and utterly committed. Though said slowly that this meant abandoning millennia of military tradition. Delina replied that tradition meant nothing if they were all dead, and that she was suggesting it because a mortal woman taught her that sometimes the only wisdom that mattered was survival. She felt Lydia surprised and saw the captain's eyes widen, but Selenara meant every word, because 3 days with humans had taught her more about living than 3,000 years of immortality. The council debate lasted hours, and Selenara stood through all of it with Lydia beside her, and they were 2 warriors from vastly different worlds united by friendship forged and fire finely filmed. Spoke and said the council would authorize a trial program and 3 joint task forces with human and council personnel to engage Krell. Advanced forces and results would be reviewed in 1 cycle. It was not Everything but it was a start. As they left the chamber, Lydia let out a long breath and said, "That was terrifying," Zella said. Lydia had addressed the council and called them cowards, and that was either brave or suicidal. Lydia grinned and said, "Probably a little of both," and asked if it would actually works. Lenara admitted she did not know, but that 3 weeks ago she would have said saving Lydia was impossible, and then illogical, and then inadvisable, but now she could not imagine having done anything else. They walked through council station corridors, drawing stares from beings who could not process an elf and human moving like old friends. Vexrith waited at the docking bay, and his massive form drew crowds of curious onlookers. The dragon asked through the bond how it went. Lydia replied that they did not die, so she was calling it a win, and she had learned to sense his mental questions. During the battle, Selenara's ship waited fully repaired and modified with accommodations for crew, and tactical stations for human hands and medical bay for both elven and mortal physiology. Lydia asked what happened. Lenara said now they would build those task forces and train council species to think like humans and teach humans to use technology they could not dream of a year ago, and create something new. Lydia said, an army of immortals who fought like they were mortal. Solera added immortals who survived like they were immortals. She said Captain Hayes had promised to teach her everything about humanity and about making every moment matter. Lydia said the offer was still good, but warned that if Selenara really wanted to understand humanity, she needed to understand what they were fighting for and not just survival, but the future they were trying to build. Selenara said she was 3,000 years old and had seen countless futures built and destroyed. Lydia asked if Selenara had ever helped build one, and she extended her hand and said this time it would be real partnership, and not one saving the other, but actually working together to create something. That Lestat Solera looked at that offered hand, and it was scarred from battle and trembling from exhaustion and belonging to someone who would be dust in less than a century. By every measure of elven wisdom, attachment to mortals was foolish because they died, and they always died. But they lived first, and how intensely they lived. She took Lydia's hand and said partners, though she warned that 3,000 years of habits were hard to break. Lydia grinned and warned that mortals were exhausting to keep up with because they did not sleep much and talked constantly and had this